Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Can you hear me fine? Okay. Thank you for joining us. My name is Leslie Ma. I'm the Ming-Chu Xu and Daniel Xu curator in the Department of Modern Contemporary Art here at the Met. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to all of you to come here tonight. I want to express my gratitude to the artist, Yang-Tze, for giving us such an amazing commission project, and for my colleagues' support, enthusiasm, and making everything a reality. I want to get the thanks out of the way so we can get to the real part of the talk. I want to thank the sponsors that make the exhibition happen, Directors Fund, Mr. T.H. Tong, Oscar and Agnes Tang, and Jenny Ye, Wing Sing Arts Foundation. And the education programs for this exhibition are made possible by the Ministry of Culture of ROC Taiwan and the Taipei Cultural Center here in New York. Thank you. As the curator for this commission in the Great Hall that opened in November 21st, a few months ago, I had the privilege of working very closely with the artist and thinking about how we can engage with our audience more related to the topic of calligraphy. So on opening night, November 21st, we had an artist talk. I was able to convince this artist, who was 82 years old and never did a talk before, to give us her first time at the Met. She shared with us some of the behind the scenes and the process of working on the commission. We had another program about a month after that called Sunday at the Met. Here, my colleagues organized 4 of us, curators at the Met here, that talked about calligraphy from each of our perspectives, from Chinese art, Japanese art, Islamic art, and modern contemporary art. So tonight's talk is at the tail end of this exhibition. We have about 3 more weeks before it closes. I want to take this opportunity to take a deep dive into Yang-Tze's work about calligraphy from the angle of politics, society, as well as everyday life. Calligraphy as a kind of fine art, but also as part of graphic culture. Calligraphy as a cultural asset, as a political statement, and perhaps the last defense against technology. So tonight, we have 2 brilliant colleagues joining me here. One is Joseph Chaya Dolberg, Oscar Tang and Agnes Xu Tang, curator of Chinese paintings at the Department of Asian Art at the Met. He's our in-house expert on the history of calligraphy and Chinese art. And today he will start us off with this history from his point of view. Jing Su, Jonathan D. Spence Chair, Professor of Comparative Literature and East Asian Languages and Literatures from Yale University, is here with us today as well. She's the author of Kingdom of Characters, a Pulitzer-nominated book which explores the history and politics behind the modernization of the Chinese script. And she'll share with her view on calligraphy in contemporary society. And I will round out this conversation or presentations from the angle of Yang-Tze's work in the context of international contemporary art. And because each of us, the 3 of us, has so much to share, we won't have a Q&A after this. Each of us will take about 18 to 20 minutes and share with you our thoughts on calligraphy from our different perspectives. I hope you can find conversations between our presentations and enjoy the calligraphy for another 3 weeks or so in the Great Hall. Thank you and welcome, Joe.
Thank you very much, Leslie. This is an absolute honor to join you and Jing for this program tonight. And good evening to all of you. Thanks for coming out and welcome to the Met. So I'm particularly grateful to have the chance to reflect on this kind of amazing situation that we've found ourselves in since November, in which this signature New York City public space, the famous 1902 Richard Morris Hunt designed Great Hall of the Met, has come under the sway of brush-written Chinese calligraphy in the form of these 2 works by Yang-Tze, which together collectively make her site-specific commission dialogue. And this really is a somewhat astounding situation. Chinese calligraphy in the Great Hall, and indeed large-scale public Chinese calligraphy as a definitive presence in the Great Hall. As Leslie will, I think, make clear later in the hour, these artworks are not just Chinese calligraphy. They draw thoughtfully and knowingly on diverse artistic lineages so effectively that they may be said to indeed reach beyond the bounds of this category, but they are without a doubt at a very fundamental level works of Chinese calligraphy. And so I want to linger with calligraphy a little bit tonight, in particular to think about the idea of and the practice of large-scale public calligraphy, which is a phenomenon that has a long history in China. And I think it's worth considering as we think about the impact of these works in this very public early 20th century space in our own 21st century moment. So I'll spend my time at the podium tonight talking about the history of large-scale public calligraphy in China. And I put it out into the spring night air as one possible avenue for contextualizing Dong Yang-Tze's work. Paintings, written accounts, and surviving monuments, and indeed old photographs like the one I'm showing you here, all testify that the pre-modern visual landscape was everywhere enlivened with large-scale calligraphic interventions. This was true for densely packed cities like the one you're seeing here, for little-traveled roads in the countryside, for gardens, and even for remote mountainsides. Those interventions that survive today are often the ones that were carved into stone, especially the unquarried stone that remains in situ. And you will sometimes hear art historians sort of rhapsodize romantically about things being carved into the living rock. When we use this phrase, this is what we're talking about, is things that have been carved into unquarried stone that remains in situ. In Chinese, these are called moya shi ke, which literally means carvings on a polished cliff. As we'll see, sometimes the cliffs got polished prior to inscription, sometimes they didn't. But in any event, this is what we call them, moya shi ke, or moya. One of the earliest moya to survive is the famous eulogy of the stone gate, the Sherman Song. This stone gate was an amazing feat of engineering. This was a tunnel cut in the year 66 CE that allowed the Baoxie plank road running from Shanxi into Sichuan province to pass directly through the rock without climbing the precipitous cliffs above, and thereby saving people a lot of time and a lot of heartache in their travels. Around a century after the tunnel's creation, in the year 148 CE, the interior rock faces of the passage began to be inscribed and carved with calligraphy, detailing the tunnel's creation and the exploits of the officials who made it possible. The exteriors were carved too, beginning even earlier, but we'll focus on the inside of the tunnel. And here on the left side of the screen, you see a large block of text. This is the eulogy of the stone gate. I'll tell you why I'm showing you old photographs in a little while. So here you see it in an old photograph, that larger block of text, and then here you see it in rubbing form. You can see it has a bit of scale to it. It's quite large, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see have a sense of the form of the characters themselves. And this is what the face of the rock itself looks like. It has a lot of texture and it undulates back and forth. It is not flat and it is not polished. So this is stone carved calligraphy, the eulogy of the stone gate. But I just want to make clear that this calligraphy also began its life as brush-written calligraphy, with a person dipping a brush into a solution of water and possibly ink, but maybe red pigment, just like Dong Yang-Tze did when she went to write her calligraphy. In this case, the calligraphy was almost certainly written directly onto the stone surface itself prior to being carved by craftspeople. There is another way to make a moya, which is to prepare the writing onto paper, which can then allow the characters to be transferred to the stone prior to carving. But in this case, scholars believe that it was written directly on the stone. And if you want to have a sense of what it might look like when someone in pre-modern China was taking brush to stone, I show you here a Song Dynasty painting where we see a person preparing to write on a cliff face. This is admittedly a very different context for cliff inscription, but I put it here just to stimulate the mind. So let's return to Shanxi for a moment. What was this calligraphy doing way out here in the middle of nowhere in a tunnel? beyond the basic work of recording the facts of this infrastructure project, it's worth thinking about what it means to place words out here in this very remote place, to literally incise them into the living rock in a durable way. This is really to make a claim on behalf of civilization, to sort of establish a beachhead, to map the edges of the human realm. The Chinese word for language, wen, is also a critical component of the compound word meaning civilization, wenming. And it's not overstating it to say that a moya of this type was really meant to civilize this wild and unforgiving mountainscape into which it was placed, to bring it into the world through this practice of inscription of human language. Created to honor an infrastructure project in the 2nd century CE, this site fell victim to another such major infrastructure intervention in 1970, when a newly created dam raised the water level in this area and inundated the stone gate. Thankfully, the carvings of the stone gate were moved at that time to the Hanzhong City Museum, where they remain today. A very different type of large public calligraphy can be found on Mount Tai, Taishan in Shandong. This is the most sacred of China's sacred mountain peaks. And you're seeing here an undated and unsigned work of calligraphy that scholars believe was written around 580 CE. And for my money, for scale anyway, this is the most impressive of these moya that dot the Chinese landscape. This is a transcription of the first 15 sections of the Buddhist scripture, the Diamond Sutra, the Jingang Jing, or the Vajracchedika Sutra. It covers 22,000 square feet, and it originally consisted of 2,799 characters, each about 20 inches in height. And I've actually seen calligraphers practice this calligraphy at full scale based on rubbings, and you'd be surprised. You don't need a giant brush to write this calligraphy. You can write it with a brush of sort of standard size, but the impact on the site is quite impressive, especially taken in aggregate. And this too, again, was presumably brushed directly onto the rock surface, brush-written calligraphy. And just to think back, to contrast this with what you see in the stone gate, we have here a somewhat different relationship between the human written word and the landscape into which it is written. Here, this is the Buddha Dharma, this is the Buddhist law, and here it is drawing power from the sacrality of the landscape into which it is inscribed. So somewhat different from that sort of marking of human intervention that one sees at the stone gate. Another famous inscription on Mount Tai is a text dated 726. This is both authored and calligraphed by Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang Dynasty. And this inscription more accurately fits the term moya because, as you can see, I'm talking here about the inscription on the right side of the screen marked in red. Everything else are later accretions to the site. But you can see that the rock was carved into the shape of a tall stele and polished before the emperor's calligraphy was carved into it. The content of the writing is a lengthy record of the emperor's performance of two ancient rituals. And by ancient, I mean to say they were ancient in 724 when the emperor went to Mount Tai to perform them. And these rituals were a really big deal. Not every emperor even attempted to perform them. So Xuanzong's successful performance of these rituals, the Feng and Shan rituals, was seen as an important component of the righteousness of his rule. So these are the emperor's words. This is his narration of the events of 724, but this is also the emperor's calligraphy. That is to say, it's his handwriting. And this is notable because in the pre-modern Chinese conception, a person's handwriting is one of the most revealing expressions of the self. Unlike in the classical Mediterranean world and later in Europe, where portraits of rulers could be seen in public, in monumental sculpture, and even on the faces of coins. In China, at this point, portraits of emperors were carefully controlled and regulated and seen by very few. The visage that could be seen was the emperor's calligraphy. And here in this large-scale public calligraphy, we have a merger of that visage with the very substance of this most sacred of Chinese mountains. So here, this is a kind of combination type of moya that has a numinous aspect. These characters draw sacred power from the mountain, but it also has a very real world relationship to power on the ground. And it's worth noting that this practice of rulers inscribing Mount Tai with their calligraphy did not begin with Emperor Xuanzong. It was already very old by this time, nor did it end with him. Here I show you a 1966 inscription of the mountain with Mao Zedong's calligraphy. This is a poem about the Long March. Another form of large-scale public calligraphy that was ubiquitous in pre-modern China, and some of which survives today, are the inscriptions on ceremonial arches. An arch could be inscribed for any number of reasons, usually to commemorate an accomplishment or an act of exceptional virtue by a local person in the community in which the arch was erected. And the right to erect and inscribe an arch was usually granted by the imperial government, so carried the weight and the authority of the emperor himself. So I'm showing you here a photograph from the early 20th century from Sichuan province of a particularly ornate ceremonial arch. And I hope you can see the horizontal inscription. It reads Yimen Sanjie from right to left. So 3 virtues within a single household, or 3 virtues within a single gate. And this was a phrase usually reserved for families in which 3 women had been widowed relatively early in life, but nevertheless had remained faithful or chaste to their deceased husbands. This was a virtue that was commonly honored in arches, especially in late imperial China. And then just above the horizontal inscription that reads Yimen Sanjie, you see one that reads Shengzhi, by imperial decree. So there is the emperor's imprimatur on the imperial arch. But there were all kinds of imperial arches. I show you another one here from Guangzhou that reads Fuzi Jinshi, the big white inscription. So father and son, Jinshi. This is to honor men in subsequent generations, a father and son, each of whom passed the highest level of imperial examinations. This was a big deal for a small community, and the arch from the early 17th century in this case is still standing today. If you want to see what arches looked like, or one rendition of what they looked like in a pre-modern Chinese cityscape, I commend to you the Qianlong Emperor's 18th century Southern Inspection Tour scroll of Suzhou. You can find more pictures on our website, and you can see arch after arch dotting the streetscape of Suzhou in the 1760s. One other type of public writing that I want to mention is something called tibishi, or poems inscribed on walls. In pre-modern China, there was a widespread practice among the scholarly class, these are the guys that we sometimes call the literati class, to compose poems while traveling and to inscribe them in public places on pretty much anything they could inscribe them on. So the walls of inns and wine shops were frequent targets for tibishi. And from literature, we know that these were ubiquitous in the pre-modern world, and they sometimes play important roles in the plots of novels. What I'm showing you here is an illustration from an illustrated novel in which we see a young scholar inscribing a poem on a blank wall. Notably, in late imperial China, tibishi were also an important vehicle for poetry by women who might otherwise struggle to find more formal avenues for publication of their poems. So naturally, tibishi were ephemeral. They were there one day and effaced the next as a wall was painted over or replaced, or the poem was written over by someone else. But this evanescence was part of the charm and the romance of a tibishi. You might miss it if you didn't get there quickly enough. But some scholars did find ways to make their poems more durable, sometimes combining the momentary inspiration of the tibishi with the durability of a moya shike. They would sometimes hire carvers in a local place to inscribe their poem on a wall, on a spare cliff face of a scenic site that had inspired them, or might otherwise commission some architectural component to have their calligraphy carved into it in an important building so that it would not be ephemeral. And so much was this the case that a traveler named Fang Bao in the 19th century complained about the ubiquity of inscriptions, of sort of doggerel by various people dotting the landscape. He wrote, "Among the mountains I have previously seen, such as Floating Mountain in Tongcheng, Anhui, or Assistance Mountain in Nanjing, and the peak that flew here in Hangzhou, the Feilai. It is not that their cliffs and caves lack beauty, but that ignorant monks have carved many figures of transcendence and Buddhas into them, while vulgar scholars have engraved their names in poems. Like sores, they are shocking when they come into sight. So, in pre-modern China, as in our own time and place, the right to inscribe, and particularly with language, was the province of power. And who had that power might be contested. One person's magnum opus could be taken as another person's vandalism. So returning to museums, the Palace Museum in Beijing has extended another classic use of large-scale public calligraphy, adopted from pre-modern China, but here extended into the modern life of these buildings, which were once palaces for emperors, but today are a museum for the people. So at the bottom of the screen, you see on the facade of the Shenwu Gate, a large plaque reading the Palace Museum, Gugongbo Yuan. And this is based on the brush-written calligraphy of Guo Moruo, a major 20th century public intellectual and scholar. But he actually was not the first person to have this honor. In 1924, when the erstwhile imperial family was finally ejected from the palace and it became the property of the people, it was Li Shizeng, an early leader of what would become this museum, who first wrote the title board. And here, the very act of labeling with large-scale brush-written calligraphy really became a key component in the transfer of ownership from the emperor to the people. Such is the power of big writing. So with all this history in mind, the big museum on Fifth Avenue looks a little forlorn, a little naked, maybe even a little bit inappropriate, with its wordless facade, with no one saying anything about what this place is and what it all means. Thank goodness that inside, at least for now, someone is saying something. Thank you.
Hello, good evening. How wonderful to have you here and spend the hour with you. And I have to say, one extra pleasure it is to be with two curators whose vision and interpretation, understanding of this exhibit, I hope, and I can imagine, will resonate well beyond the immaculate halls of the Met. Thank you, thank you. To, I think, round out the perspectives here tonight, I'd like to focus on something slightly different. So Chinese writing is ubiquitous. And as you can see from previous talk, that is monumental, it's authoritative. But it can also be prosaic, colorful, maybe loud, and actually in other contexts, talismanic and even totemic. This is if you were walking in Hong Kong's Mong Kok district, which some of you may have been to in 2019, this is what you would see. A saturation of signages, each crying and screaming out for your attention. In fact, it is so ubiquitous that any Chinese who grow up in this script milieu that a contemporary artist, who you will hear about later, Xu Bing, actually speculates and muses whether, having grown up in such a complicated environment of signage does something to you. Does it make you more amenable to following rules and observing orders unseen? So we can think about that tonight. But apart from being ubiquitous, Chinese has also been extraordinarily adaptable throughout the centuries. Now we know that Korea, Vietnam, Japan, its neighbors, have traditionally used Chinese script to, in some ways, launch their own writing systems, because it was the earliest and the most complete writing system in the region. So in fact, for pragmatic purposes, it makes complete sense to borrow elements from it in order to phoneticize or to construct your own writing system. And you did hear the word phonetic, which is not what Chinese script is normally known for now, because we tend to juxtapose it to the Western alphabet, where we give the power of phoneticism and think of Chinese more as pictographic, ideographic, something like a tetrograph that fits in a square shape, a logogram that kind of combines different elements. But in fact, Chinese language, like the Western alphabet, is part phonetic and part semantic. And we don't really look at the capital letter A now and see what the Phoenicians saw, which was an ox kind of turned 90 degrees. These are two early examples of how Chinese language was adapted by its neighboring kingdoms. The one on the right is Khitan large script, which was in use between 10th and 12th centuries. The reason I want to show you this is if you look closely, if you know Chinese, you'll see that the characters from afar in terms of the structural spatialization of it, it has every likeness to Chinese characters. It's in a square space. It has these strokes that crisscross, line up, or be at diagonal angles to one another. But if you look at it, it's not Chinese characters that a Chinese would know. That's because this was used to construct one of the two script systems that the Khitans used. And again, this is a reason why it was used, because Chinese is imagined to be like the only language script system that you've ever known. So to adapt it and to borrow from it, which now seems like a pretty extraordinarily difficult task, was about the only alternative you had. So if you grew up with this kind of complex system, it's actually not so complicated to you. It's more like a tool. The one on the left, which succeeded Khitan script, is Jurchen. And it is based on slightly different principles of borrowing from the Chinese script. But what's important there is that you already see that it's more simplified. They look less complicated because they're generally less strokes in the Jurchen script. And these are not the only two, I would say, unofficial usages of Chinese language. More recent times, you have minorities, ethnic minorities, who also construct their scripts based on properties of the Chinese character, which is to say, there's a principle of having a right part, a left part. If you divide up the square space that it inhabits into another 4 little squares, you can pretty much proportionalize and spatialize a Chinese character within that space. So imagine this is like a 4-piece puzzle. This is when it gets more interesting. Now, when I look at script as tool, Chinese script as tool, it is not usually how we think of it. We think of it as something, we can think of it as something, traditional, something mystical, something beautiful, something aesthetic. But if you look at it as a tool, it makes perfect sense that throughout the centuries, it happened to proliferate the way that, let's say, English language proliferated since the British Empire. It opened itself up to a lot of adaptations in order to globalize. And so apart from Khitan Jurchen, I list here Vietnam, which was actually using parts of this logographic composition up to the early 20th century. This is a pretty long period of time to be using the Chinese script. In fact, when Vietnam fell to the French, there was a beautiful phrase that what you heard was the silent brushes falling to the ground, because after that, the Roman alphabet took over, right? And you will see that for Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, something happened close to the 20th century. It's true that Japan continued to use Chinese character script in the present, but it has also draws on 2 other script systems, hiragana and katakana, which is more phonetic syllabaries. But those 2 systems were also derived actually from calligraphic Chinese script. Oops. So something happened in the late 19th century that was a bottleneck for Chinese script. Imagine for thousands of years, it didn't really have to think about it. It was the source of influence, but it never had to readapt itself or imagine having to adjust to any kind of order or rule. That changed in the late 19th century with the coming of global communications technology. You have the typewriter. This is the earliest Chinese typewriter. You will see that it's pretty much kind of a workman style, a blunt instrument approach, because the idea behind it was that what you see on that disc, all those little scribbles, you would just simply fit whole characters on that whole disc drum. And the way you would use it is kind of turn it the way I had imagined, disc jockey in the 1980s would do it, and then line up with the proper script and then print it. And this was done actually by an American Presbyterian missionary. So the first Chinese typewriter was not invented by Chinese, but by rather outsiders who had every reason to want to get into the Chinese environment. Now, about 30, 40 years later, you now see the growing influence and dominance of an alphabetic world infrastructure. Here you have a very famous typewriter by one of my favorite writers of the 20th century, Lin Yutang, whose secret passion turns out all along was to invent this particular typewriter. And you now see that there's a lot more strictures. It's no longer about fitting whole characters on every key, because you can see this is an alphabetic kind of QWERTY keyboard. There's no way that you can fit thousands of characters onto a keyboard that is designed for 26 characters. And what Lin Yutang did was something quite ingenious. So when Chinese encountered the alphabetic language, they had to think about, well, we're clearly not going to compete by having to preserve and to invent technologies that would fit, give one key to each character. You have a very unwieldy machine, probably the size of this room. What you can do, however, cleverly, Lin Yutang thought, was to maybe think about how to incorporate the alphabetic logic into the Chinese script itself, which it actually already had the power to do so because, as many of you know, the Chinese script relies on a kind of phonetic classifier. There's one part of it by which you can use to index and to locate and to find, to retrieve Chinese characters in a dictionary. But it's also, I think I should also say that using a Chinese language dictionary is not for the faint of heart. It's very complicated with several steps. Of course, meanwhile, what else happened in the 20th century is that script, following its centuries of alignment with power, authority, rule, was also elevated to a new level of kind of politicization, of manifestation of power. This was taken in 1966 during the Cultural Revolution. Revolutionary rebels were putting up posters in Beijing. And here, script is very much used to ensnare, to entrap, to accuse, to vilify, to imprison. And this also is kind of the growing power, in some way, the authoritarian nature of script, which had happened throughout the century of Chinese writing. Now, what has happened since? So since Chinese entered a typewriter, the idea, the challenge to mechanize Chinese reproduction set into motion a series of inventions, which I'm not going to here. But what it does was to essentially later put Chinese characters into the computer. Now, by breaking down the character, like you saw on the typewriter keyboard, into these components, essentially what the Chinese were able to do was to use a kind of alphabetic logic to make Chinese almost modular to use, where you can decompose and break down a character like you would letters of a word, and then put it back together according to different shapes. Now, there's the additional challenge, of course, because, as I said, the components of Chinese character is not only that you arrange them within a certain space, but that those components can actually look quite different depending on where in the square that they show up. Because there's also kind of a principle of balance and aestheticism where you cannot, you have to make things kind of fit together rather than they have to be proportional and they can be pleasing to the eye. And to this day, it is still very controversial. What exactly is that pleasing configuration? What I threw on here, the last slide, is a smattering of different type of fonts, which to you probably look like calligraphic styles. But these are actually generated by computers. Now, for the past 10, 15 years, there's been an explosion, which is not very well known outside of Chinese sphere, explosion of font design. And imagine if you had thousands of characters and you had these stroke types that you can fatten or slim down, or as you can see in the Great Hall, do incredible things to it to go beyond form, to lend it freedom, to make it continuous. Imagine what other creative things you can do with the digital sphere where, well, you can kind of manipulate through programs and algorithms to create new kinds of calligraphy. Now, to many of you here in the audience, this might not look that different from every other example of photographs that you're seeing here tonight. But this actually has created quite a bit of controversy in the past several years. About in 2019, there was a man who's a calligrapher himself. He launched this launched his critique against this rampant proliferation of font designs because he's mostly disturbed by the fact that they get mistaken for the real thing, that people might not appreciate the craftsmanship, the human endeavor, the kind of self-cultivation aspect, and the kind of everything that captured what's human about us. He's afraid that it'll be completely lost and then the next generation will not even know the difference. And so around that time, this kind of created a kind of a movement where there's now a kind of dictate from the Ministry of Education to warn against the proliferation of these rampant personalized font designs, where some of them even actually really transgress upon traditional rules of calligraphy. Now, of course, this is where we get into a very interesting question about what does it mean when we look at font design, we look at calligraphy as transformation of form. There has to be a form in order to be transformed. But where we actually recognize, where we place the value on form, is very much something that we take for granted as convention, as norms passed down. But in fact, if you think about script as tool, as technology, there's something fundamentally arbitrary about our invention of writing at all. It is a marvelous thing, for sure, the first technology that opened the way to all technologies, where you can actually pull the thought out of your head. You can actually put it on a piece of paper or surface. You can look at it, use it to refine what you're thinking, communicate with others across time and space, or in the cases of many photographs we saw here, thousands of years, hundreds of years after. And you can use that to communicate and commune with your fellow human beings. It's an extraordinary feat. But at the end of the day, it is really a kind of arbitrary equivalence between what we agree on is a mark on a page with a sound that we decide to peg to it. This is one of the extraordinary things that's given Chinese calligraphy such flexibility and such, I think, potential to have survived. About 130 years ago, there were actually a group of Chinese reformers who were perfectly ready to let go of the Chinese writing altogether. They thought it's way too complicated. It is not like airplane. It's like an ox cart. You can't travel with it. And we must Romanize and alphabetize wholesale if we want to survive in the 20th century. And yet 130 years later, you see that Chinese script, not only that technology has not posed a barrier to Chinese language, but rather a kind of extension and continuation. And it's really because at the end of it, it is a human endeavor. The reason that we agree what is form and what is transformation is because even though we subscribe to different kind of writing systems, there's a sense that this is our invention and that it is a worthy struggle to continue to invest in the value that we attach to it. So I leave you with that.
Thank you, Jing and Joe, for the informative talks. And I will round up tonight's lecture by turning into contemporary art. In the 1970s, while living in New York, Yang-Tze, who had trained in Chinese calligraphy since her youth, saw a path open for her. The gestural paintings by abstract expressionists that she saw in museums sparked a sense of competition. She saw their line work as something she had the confidence to surpass with her calligraphy. Her cultural background made her feel assured, while her training in oil painting could differentiate her from calligraphy practitioners back in Taiwan. The prominent, generous wall spaces given to abstract paintings in American museums felt like an invitation. As she remembered, as she recently told us, quote, "I really took this as a challenge to myself, to indulge myself, to do something large scale in the future," unquote. This moment of revelation, strengthened by the sense of duty toward revitalizing the art form of calligraphy, defined Yang-Tze's career path. She was born in Shanghai in 1942 and moved to Taipei with her family a decade later. She began learning calligraphy at the age of 9 and was educated in both Chinese and Western art. Her work comes out of a strong drive to reconcile her training in ink and paint and her willful questioning of traditional systems of evaluating art. Her training in Yang-Tze's bold lines and muscular structure anchors her project. While Yang-Tze's calligraphy can be considered part of 20th century East Asian artists' shared efforts to reinterpret heritage art forms, including ink painting and calligraphy, hers is a singular force that shows loyalty to calligraphy's formal, semantic, and material nature while maintaining its relevance in contemporary society. And here you see Ling Yutang popping out in the captions. In the 1970s and 80s Taiwan, Yang-Tze's calligraphy broke open the most revered genre of traditional Chinese art, a space typically reserved for male elites and intellectuals. From the 1990s onward, her work's oversized scale, genre-bending installations, and socially engaged concepts have addressed calligraphy's existential crisis and renewed its image in public culture. Calligraphy in Chinese art history has been understood as painting of the mind, 心画. It embodies an intricate relationship to painting and reveals an artist's inner world. Yang-Tze's work explored both these aspects. Many scholars have compared her to Huaisu, the Tang Dynasty monk calligrapher famous for wild cursive, an expressive style of integrity and artistry. But one of her most remarkable accomplishments is to integrate painting into calligraphy. Additionally, her work's monumental size has developed in tandem with contemporary methods of display and museums. In the next 15 minutes, I hope to broaden the connections between Yang-Tze's work and the international context beyond the narrative of Chinese art. First, as Yang-Tze saw her approach to line making and scale in dialogue with abstract expressionist paintings, a discussion on the affinities and differences between their forms, concepts, and expressions offer a productive pathway to understand mark and image making under different historical and personal circumstances. Second, Yang-Tze's use of phrases from classical Chinese literature has been mostly overlooked in the context of language and art. Her deployment of text and characters to address socio-political issues merits a meaningful comparison with works by Glenn Ligon and Xu Bing. These new critical reflections will shed light on the complexity of Yang-Tze's aesthetic and expression in the contemporary context and the need for these aspects to be fully integrated in the discourse. Dong arrived in New York in the fall of 1967 to attend the Brooklyn Museum Art School after graduating from the fine art program of the National Normal University in Taipei. She then received an MFA in oil painting from University of Massachusetts Amherst in 1970 and lived in New York until returning to Taipei in 1977. During this time in the United States, the legacy of abstract expressionism loomed large, and minimalist and conceptual art flourished through video, sculpture, and performance. For a cosmopolitan artist in the 1970s, versed in multiple artistic forms and working in New York, embracing calligraphy was a radical act. Yang-Tze's first innovation in the early 70s was to adopt square formats that were uncommon in Chinese painting and calligraphy. Shown here is her first solo exhibition in Taiwan in 1973. The square fundamentally shifted the relationship between the characters and composition. Elevating compositional priority would thus shape how Yang-Tze worked, especially as her pieces increased in size. Instead of spontaneous writing as her brushwork might suggest, she works on her composition in the sketch before using a brush, a process akin to painting or graphic design. She envisions the design for a character based on the demands of the composition, the syntax of her chosen phrase, and the desired visual effect. Sometimes she references historical precedents of a character in calligraphy copybooks. This strategy allows her to freely mix regular, running, and cursive scripts. As she manipulates the contours and proportions of the characters, she honors the writing orientation from top to bottom, right to left, and never deconstructs the Chinese script. For example, in Don't Ignore One's Conscience, 不昧, The characters with visible Yan-Zhenqing ancestry are pushed to abstraction, but the trace of the brush is present. For Dong, the rules and conventions of calligraphy are not restrictive, but generative. In other words, she subverts calligraphy, but remains true to tradition. Dong Yang-Tze's painting endeavor in calligraphy and her imagined rivalry with abstract expressionism broaden the ways in which we can read her work. For an artist with knowledge on both Chinese and Western art, her project addresses the legacies of post-war abstraction and of Chinese calligraphy and ink painting simultaneously. Dong saw herself in competition with Willem de Kooning in particular. On a trip to the US in 1997, she saw an exhibition of de Kooning's late paintings from the 1980s at the Museum of Modern Art. In her opinion, his loose lines lacked structure and force, and she felt she could do better. These paintings from the 1980s, when de Kooning was in his late 70s and early 80s, differ from his intense earlier works and have been noted for their spare compositions of lines, colors, and forms. Unbeknownst to Dong Yang-Tze, the effect of de Kooning's years of alcohol abuse and the onset of Alzheimer's disease had diminished the elder painter's strength and stamina, and he worked with assistants and a mechanized easel. The late paintings are more like drawings as the painter scraped, sanded, and rubbed paint with his fingers, palm, or paper towels to create surface effects. However, the abstractions, as scholars have found, still conjure motifs of body and landscape. In this work, Pirate, Untitled 2 from 1981 in the MoMA's collection, for example, ribbon-like lines with billowing movement dominate, an effect created by his use of a scraper to pull the paint. The flowing white space in the middle reminded the artist of pirate ships in children's stories. Each line is a product of repeated calculation and negotiation, as it insinuates traces of a figure. Dong in the 1980s and 1990s, on the other hand, was just entering her prime. Her lines are guided by Yang-Tze, the energy flow from one column or character to the next, and are powered by interactions between the material, her breath, her body, and of course, the text. In this work, Vast as Mist Over the Sea, Hao Ru Yanhai from 1997, made around the time she saw de Kooning's late paintings, the brushstrokes with extremely watery ink create a misty feel that is both inherent in the meaning of the phrase and the visual expression. At the same time, the composition is governed by the character structure. The work demonstrates that the movement and rhythm inherent in the act of writing naturally pushes her to converse with Western painting. Unlike de Kooning's process where paint can be piled up or sanded down to create lines and forms, Dong's ink and paper allow for no correction or hesitation. All is created in one go. This is the main source of Dong Yang-Tze's pride in her lines. Her method shows that calligraphy and ink, as expressive forces, can generate a myriad of dynamics between surface structure, material substance, textual meaning, and image that communicates differently from the marks made by de Kooning and his peers, coming to abstraction through representation. The content of Dong Yang-Tze's work has always been classical texts that celebrate integrity, harmony, and self-determination. Drawing often from Confucian, Taoist and Buddhist philosophy, as well as renowned literary texts, she conveys her aspirations and advice for herself and for society. This notion of social responsibility is the unique quality of Dong Yang-Tze's work. Occasionally, she writes a long poem, but more often she selects short phrases which she rewrites at different points of her life, so she can keep playing with forms and deliver a visually and socially compelling image. The two pieces of monumental calligraphy in the Met commission serve as the artist's motto and resonate with contemporary time as they did in ancient periods. Stones from other mountains can refine our jade from 2024 on the southern wall of the Great Hall. It's from the Book of Odes, calls for acceptance of differences and criticism. Go where it is right, stop when one must. These are words by the Song Dynasty artist-scholar Su Shi. It underscores the importance of self-awareness and moral restraint. Both works mix regular and running scripts in ink on paper. The lines interact with one another, the paper, and the space, and activate the vast hall with simplicity, lyricism, and a message about tolerance and discipline. Yang-Tze's repurposing of historical text to illuminate the present makes me think of the American artist Glenn Ligon, whose signature style in the 1990s fused abstraction and identity politics, integrating the formal, conceptual, and metaphorical properties of language. In his painting, Ligon stencils an English text in oil stick to engage with the history of African American representation and marginalization. The distortion, occlusion, and eventual disappearance of the words in the painting process through transferring, smudging, and overlapping forms a metaphor. By quoting Black writers, Ligon draws a literary and social history of injustice and transcendence into his work. Untitled, here you see, Untitled, I Am an Invisible Man from 1991, which quotes from Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, Invisible Man, shows the letters filling the whole composition and becoming illegible from top to bottom from the layering and blurring effect of stenciling thick paint. This formal erasure eerily and ironically demonstrates the text and context. The struggle to read parallels the density and the weight of the words, as Ligon explained. The aesthetics and the meaning in his view are always in competition. In this sense, Ligon's interaction of form, structure, meaning, history, viewing experience, and emotional impact speaks to Yang-Tze's melding of expressive and linguistic content in her work. For Yang-Tze, however, illegibility is not necessarily a metaphorical device, but a declaration of compositional and stylistic pursuit, a transcription of bodily movement. If textual meaning can be conveyed on any scale, what is the need for monumentality? Yang-Tze encourages physical engagement with the ink, traces, characters, and language as objects. In this sense, Xu Bing, whose breakthrough installation work with the Chinese language and text in the 1980s and 1990s, served as an important counterpoint to Yang-Tze's calligraphy. While Dong expresses her respect for the history and values embedded in the Chinese script by showcasing countless ways of writing elegantly with a brush, Xu Bing draws on illegible symbols he invented to interrogate systems of knowledge production and consumption. Between 1987 and 1991, Xu Bing developed 4,000 fake characters with components and made-up configurations that yield no meaning or sound. He hand-carved them on wood blocks and designed a layout resembling traditional thread-bound books, here you see on the bottom right. His monumental creation, a work entitled Book from the Sky, 1987 to 91, here you see on the left, which is once installed in our galleries in the Chinese painting galleries. This work denies the fundamental medium of transmission, language and the script. Xu Bing said, quote, "It reflected the all I felt toward language, that I could not enter it, but I also could not escape from it," unquote. Meticulous in its design, production, and execution, these books are impenetrable, no matter the language abilities of the viewer. The display of unreadable symbols on paper covering an entire room caused frustration and anxiety. Xu's deconstruction of Chinese characters is in fact not for the sake of negation, but a conceptual rebuke to the specter of the authoritarian canon, to shock in order to resuscitate. If Yang-Tze's work emphasizes individuality and agency by energizing calligraphy and the Chinese script, Xu Bing, having lived through the Cultural Revolution in China, challenges the systems through an absurdist method as an homage to tradition and humanity at the risk of being destroyed. Both artists, despite different visual strategies and life experiences, use their work as a meditation on intellectual freedom, expressed through a reverence for the Chinese script and the tradition it embodies and disseminates. Language and text as social critique and embodiments of violence are central in Ligon's and Xu's work. Their manipulation of comprehension from the text and script becomes the source of the conceptual punch. In contrast, Yang-Tze's straightforward celebration of language as visual form and cultural legacy almost seems old-fashioned. Yet her presentation advocates for the agency of language in the same confrontational manner as both Ligon and Xu. The human-sized characters are reminders of the physical nature of language. In a way, her work is a declaration of the primacy in impact, beauty, and message of the handwritten script in an image-saturated technological world. She demonstrates that calligraphy is indeed a synthesis and reframing of lines, text, and image, and turns that tension into her creative potential. The golden age of Asian art at the Met, as the New York Times had called it, was in fact kicked off by a legendary 1972 exhibition of classical Chinese calligraphy. That was a time when Yang-Tze was living here in New York City and committing her life and career to calligraphy. Though she does not remember seeing the Met exhibition, recently, when she was here during the opening of the show, she spent time in the Asian galleries with Chinese calligraphy, as well as in the modern contemporary wing, looking at Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, and Helen Frankenthaler. When calligraphy as a genre seems to have resisted globalization, Yang-Tze absorbed painting strategies to revitalize and accentuate its formal properties, to advocate for its international readability. Her project here at the museum's Great Hall seems to have fulfilled the challenge she set for herself of showing the power of her lines in the presence of the museum's classical calligraphy collections and on the abstract expressionist home turf. She defined modernity for the art of writing on her own terms. Thank you very much for sitting with us for this hour and listening to us talking about calligraphy, such an old-fashioned topic. And I want to send my gratitude to Joe and Jing for sharing that moment with us. I really enjoyed your talks and learned a lot, and I hope you all do too. We have about 3 more weeks until the finish of the exhibition, so please come back. It's free to come to the Great Hall, and have a good night. Thank you.